Between 1874 and 1880, 43 immigrant families mysteriously failed to complete their journeys across Wyoming territory. Each was last seen at the same farmstead. In the summer of 1880, when sheriff's deputies descended into that farm's basement, what they discovered became the most systematic cannibalism operation in American Western history, and the Carver family had turned this practice into a family tradition. Before we descend into the darkness that consumed the Carver family and their victims, this channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to confront the most disturbing truths hidden in America's past. If you're one of the few who can handle these dark revelations, subscribe now and leave a comment telling me what state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover the stories that others dare not tell. Now, let's journey back to 1874, when the Oregon Trail promised hope but delivered horror to those who trusted the wrong family. The Wyoming Territory of 1874 stretched like an endless sea of grass and sagebrush, a harsh and unforgiving landscape that tested every pioneer brave enough to cross it. The Oregon Trail, that legendary pathway to promised prosperity in the Pacific Northwest, cut through Wyoming's heart like a scar across the earth. For the thousands of families who sold everything they owned for a chance at new lives, Wyoming represented both the final major obstacle and the gateway to their dreams. The territory was sparsely populated, with settlements scattered dozens of miles apart, connected only by wagon ruts worn deep into the prairie soil by countless wheels that had passed before. The journey across Wyoming typically took 3 to 4 weeks of hard travel, and by the time most wagon trains reached this stretch of the trail, families were exhausted, supplies were running dangerously low, and the weakest members were often succumbing to trail fever, dysentery, and the countless other ailments that turned dreams of prosperity into desperate struggles for survival. It was in this landscape of vulnerability and desperation that the Carver family established their farmstead in the spring of 1874, positioning themselves precisely where desperate travelers would be most grateful for assistance. Elijah Carver was 42 years old when he arrived in Wyoming with his wife Martha, age 38, and their 4 children. Samuel was 19, Rebecca 17, Thomas 14, and young Mary just 11. To anyone who met them, the Carvers appeared to be exactly what they claimed, a hard-working farming family seeking to build a new life on the frontier, hoping to prosper by offering services to the constant stream of travelers passing through on their way west. Elijah was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a thick beard and coal-used hands that spoke of a lifetime of labor. Martha was a sturdy woman with a kind face and a gentle manner that immediately put visitors at ease. The Carver farmstead sat approximately 40 miles west of Fort Bridger, at a point where the Oregon Trail passed within a quarter-mile of a reliable creek. This location was strategic beyond what most travelers would have realized. By this point in their journey, most wagon trains had depleted much of their provisions and were facing the daunting prospect of crossing the remaining stretches of Wyoming before reaching the comparative safety of Idaho Territory. The Carvers offered exactly what such desperate families needed: a place to rest, to water their livestock, to purchase fresh supplies, and most importantly, to enjoy a hot meal and a night's sleep under a solid roof instead of beneath wagon canvas. The farmhouse itself was substantial for a frontier dwelling, a 2-story wooden structure with a wide front porch and a welcoming appearance that spoke of prosperity and stability. Behind the main house stood a large barn, several outbuildings, and a sprawling vegetable garden that seemed to flourish despite Wyoming's harsh climate. To weary travelers who had been on the trail for months, enduring hardship after hardship, the Carver farm must have appeared like an oasis of civilization in the wilderness, a reminder that comfort and safety still existed somewhere in the world. What made the Carvers particularly appealing to passing emigrants was their pricing structure. Unlike other frontier establishments that charged exorbitant rates for basic services, knowing that desperate travelers had little choice but to pay, the Carvers offered remarkably reasonable prices for meals, lodging, and supplies. For just $2, a family could enjoy a substantial hot meal. For an additional $3, they could sleep in the house's guest rooms rather than on the hard ground. Fresh vegetables, eggs, and preserved meats were available for purchase at prices that seemed almost too good to be true. The Carvers had arrived in Wyoming in April of 1874, having traveled from Missouri, where Elijah claimed to have worked as a farmer and occasional butcher. They purchased their property from a previous settler who had given up on making the land profitable, paying in cash that Elijah said came from years of saving. Within weeks of their arrival, they had made improvements to the existing structures and begun advertising their services to passing wagon trains. Word spread quickly along the trail that the Carver farm was a good place to stop, that the family was honest and friendly, and that their prices were fair. During the peak travel season of 1874, between May and September, an estimated 300 wagon trains passed along the Oregon Trail through Wyoming, representing thousands of individual travelers. Most were families, though there were also single men seeking fortune, small groups of friends traveling together, and occasionally larger organized parties. The Carvers welcomed all of them with the same warm hospitality, the same promises of rest and refreshment, and the same reasonable prices that made stopping seem like an obvious choice. The first family to disappear was the Hendersons, a group of 7 including parents, 4 children, and a widowed grandmother. They arrived at the Carver farm on June 15, 1874, exhausted after 3 months on the trail, and grateful for the opportunity to rest. According to the trail diary kept by the wagon train master, whose group the Hendersons had been traveling with, the family had decided to remain at the Carver farm for 3 days to allow their eldest daughter, who had been suffering from fever, to recover strength before continuing. The rest of the wagon train departed after one night, expecting the Hendersons to catch up within a week. The Hendersons were never seen again. When inquiries were eventually made, months later, Elijah Carver informed questioners that the family had indeed stayed for 3 days, had then departed westward on June 18, and he had no knowledge of what might have befallen them afterward. Given the numerous dangers of trail travel, the disappearance of a single family, while tragic, was not particularly unusual or suspicious. The frontier was littered with graves of those who had started for Oregon or California, but never completed the journey. The pattern would repeat itself throughout that summer and into the fall. Family after family would stop at the Carver farm, would stay for a few days, and would then vanish without ever reaching their intended destination. In retrospect, the frequency of these disappearances should have raised immediate alarm. However, several factors conspired to keep the Carvers' activities hidden from suspicion. The transient nature of trail travel meant that no single authority was tracking individual families as they moved westward. If a family failed to arrive at their destination, relatives back east might wonder and worry, but they had no way of knowing where along the 2,000-mile journey something had gone wrong. The various wagon trains were not in constant communication with each other, so one train master would have no way of knowing that another train had lost a family at the exact same location weeks earlier. The high mortality rate on the frontier trails was well documented, with death from disease, accidents, and violence being tragically common. But perhaps most importantly, the Carvers were extraordinarily careful in their selection of victims. They never targeted families traveling with larger wagon trains who would be immediately missed. Instead, they focused on small groups traveling alone, or families who had already separated from their trains for various reasons. They preferred immigrants who spoke little English, who had few connections in America, and whose disappearance would be unlikely to prompt extensive investigation. They never took more than one family per month, allowing sufficient time between incidents to avoid establishing any obvious pattern. The Carver's operation was not the frenzied violence of madmen, but rather a calculated business enterprise conducted with chilling efficiency. When a suitable family arrived at the farm, the Carvers would assess them carefully during the first evening, evaluating their resources, their destination, their connections, and most importantly, their vulnerability. If the family seemed like a safe target, the Carvers would extend exceptional hospitality, offering additional services at reduced prices, encouraging the family to stay an extra day or two, and gradually separating them from any awareness of other travelers on the trail. The actual murders typically occurred on the second or third night of a family's stay, after they had been fed a substantial evening meal that included liberal amounts of alcohol to ensure deep sleep. The Carvers would wait until well after midnight, then systematically enter the guest rooms where their victims slept. The method was brutally efficient. Elijah and his eldest son Samuel would restrain the adult men, while Martha and the older children dealt with the women and children. Death came by strangulation or by blade, depending on the situation, but always quietly enough to avoid alerting others who might be camping nearby. Once the victims were dead, the Carvers would immediately begin the process of disposal and asset extraction. The bodies would be carried down to the basement, where a specialized butchering operation awaited. This was where Elijah's claimed experience as a butcher became horrifyingly relevant. The basement had been converted into what was essentially a human abattoir, equipped with butchering tables, cutting tools, hooks for hanging carcasses, and a sophisticated system for processing human flesh into manageable portions. The Carvers wasted nothing. Clothing and personal possessions were carefully sorted, with anything valuable being kept and anything potentially identifying being burned. Wagon contents were thoroughly inventoried and either kept for the family's use or prepared for eventual sale in distant markets where their origin would never be questioned. Livestock and horses were rebranded and added to the Carvers' own herds. Even the wagons themselves were dismantled, with useful wood being repurposed for farm construction. But it was the treatment of the bodies that represented the Carvers' most disturbing practice. In the basement, equipped with the tools and knowledge of a professional butcher, Elijah would process the corpses exactly as one would process animal carcasses. Flesh was separated from bone, fat was rendered for cooking and soap making, organs were either consumed immediately or preserved, and even bones were saved to be ground into meal for fertilizer. Nothing was discarded as waste. The human meat the Carvers harvested served multiple purposes in their economy of horror. First and most obviously, it provided sustenance for the family itself. The Carvers consumed human flesh as a regular part of their diet, with Martha preparing it in the same ways she would prepare any other meat. The children ate without question or complaint, having been raised to view this practice as normal. Second, the meat supplemented the food the Carvers served to their guests. The delicious stews and roasts that travelers praised so highly often contained ingredients that those travelers would have found unthinkable. Finally, some of the preserved meat was actually sold to other travelers as frontier provisions, meaning that families continuing westward might unknowingly carry with them the flesh of those who had disappeared before them. As the months progressed through 1874 and into 1875, the Carvers refined their operation into a smooth, almost industrial process. Each murder, each butchering session, each disposal of evidence became more efficient. The children took on increasingly important roles in the family business. Samuel became his father's primary assistant in the actual killing and butchering. Rebecca and Thomas helped their mother with food preparation and maintaining the murder rooms. Even young Mary had assigned duties in sorting through victims' possessions. The farm itself prospered visibly. The Carvers' fields seemed unusually fertile, producing robust crops that other settlers envied. The family's livestock were healthy and numerous. The farmhouse underwent continuous improvements, with new additions being built, and the property expanding. To any outside observer, the Carvers appeared to be exactly what frontier mythology celebrated, a hard-working family thriving through honest labor and determination. By the end of 1875, the Carvers had murdered at least 18 families, representing more than 70 individual victims. The basement contained hundreds of pounds of preserved human flesh. The family's financial situation had improved dramatically through the theft of their victims' resources, and they now possessed one of the most prosperous farms in that region of Wyoming. Yet despite this apparent success, they faced a growing problem that would ultimately lead to their downfall. With each passing month, the statistical anomaly became harder to explain away as mere coincidence. The spring of 1876 brought more than just melting snow and returning wagon trains to Wyoming territory. It brought Marshal James Blackwood, a man whose persistence would finally expose the horror that had been operating in plain sight for nearly 2 years. Blackwood was 47 years old, a former Union cavalry officer who had spent the decades since the war's end bringing order to the chaos of the frontier. He had tracked outlaws across 3 territories, survived 2 gunfights, and developed a reputation for solving cases that others had given up on. But nothing in his career had prepared him for what he would discover at the Carver farm. Blackwood's involvement began in February of 1876, when he received a letter from a Massachusetts attorney representing the family of German immigrants who had departed for Oregon in the spring of 1874 and had never been heard from again. The attorney had compiled information from multiple families who had lost contact with relatives traveling west, and he had noticed a disturbing pattern. 7 different families, all traveling through Wyoming in 1874 and 1875, had sent their last letters from Fort Bridger, mentioning their intention to stop at a farm owned by a family named Carver before continuing westward. None had ever reached their destinations. The marshal began his investigation by collecting every scrap of information available about disappearances along the Wyoming stretch of the Oregon Trail. He sent letters to trail guides, wagon train masters, territorial officials, and anyone else who might have relevant knowledge. The responses that came back over the following weeks painted a troubling picture. At least 20 families had vanished without a trace in that specific region during the past 2 years. Most had been traveling alone or in small groups. Many had been immigrants with limited English skills, and in case after case, when last known locations could be determined, the Carver farm kept appearing in the records. By April, Blackwood had compiled a list of 37 families that had definitely or probably disappeared after staying at the Carver farm. The statistical likelihood of this being coincidence was essentially 0, but statistics were not evidence that would hold up in territorial court. He needed proof of actual crimes, and that meant he needed to investigate the farm itself. On May 12, 1876, Marshal Blackwood arrived at the Carver farm for the first time, traveling alone and posing as a prospector heading to the California goldfields. He carried enough money and equipment to make the story plausible, and he made sure the Carvers could see that he was a man of some means. The family welcomed him with the same warm hospitality they had shown to so many others, offering him supper, lodging, and friendly conversation about trail conditions and mining prospects. Blackwood spent that first visit carefully observing everything about the farm and its inhabitants. The property was indeed prosperous, perhaps unusually so for its remote location and the short time the family had been there. The main house was well maintained and had clearly been expanded since its original construction. The barn and outbuildings were in excellent condition. The livestock were healthy and numerous. Martha Carver served an excellent supper of stew, fresh bread, and preserved vegetables, and the portions were generous. The children were well fed and well clothed, showing none of the signs of deprivation common among frontier families. But there were details that troubled the marshal's trained eye. The basement door, which he glimpsed briefly when Martha descended to fetch preserves, had an unusually heavy lock on it, the kind typically used for strong rooms or armories rather than root cellars. The family's meat supply seemed excessive for a farm that would have limited access to livestock processing facilities. The eldest son, Samuel, had a hardness in his eyes that seemed out of place in a 19-year-old farm boy. And there was something about the way the family interacted, a smoothness and coordination that suggested they had worked together on complex tasks requiring precise timing and cooperation. None of these observations constituted evidence of murder or cannibalism. Blackwood paid for his lodging the next morning, thanked the Carvers for their hospitality, and continued westward along the trail. But he had not abandoned his investigation. Instead, he began the process of building a case that would require patience, careful planning, and personal risk. Over the next 6 weeks, Blackwood traveled extensively throughout Wyoming and into neighboring territories, interviewing anyone who might have information about the missing families. He spoke with dozens of trail guides, dozens of wagon train masters, and hundreds of settlers who lived along the Oregon Trail. He examined records at Fort Bridger, Fort Laramie, and every other military post and trading station in the region. He collected written statements from people who had seen the missing families at various points in their journeys, and slowly, methodically, he constructed a timeline that demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt that the Carver farm was the common link between all of the disappearances. But proving that families had vanished after staying at the Carver farm was not the same as proving that the Carvers had murdered them. Blackwood needed physical evidence or witness testimony that would directly implicate the family in criminal activity, and the only way to obtain such evidence was to catch the Carvers in the act of attempting murder or to search their property and find proof of their crimes. The problem was that searching the property required a warrant, and obtaining a warrant required probable cause that would convince a territorial judge. Blackwood's statistical analysis, while compelling to him, was circumstantial evidence that might not be sufficient for a warrant. He needed something more concrete, something that would justify a search of the farm, and particularly of that heavily locked basement. In late June, Blackwood made a decision that his superiors would later describe as either brilliantly courageous or recklessly foolish. He would return to the Carver farm as an apparent victim, presenting himself as exactly the sort of target the family preferred, and he would give them the opportunity to attempt his murder. But he would not go alone and unprotected. He would have backup positioned nearby, ready to intervene at the first sign of violence. Blackwood recruited 4 deputies he had worked with before, men whose courage and discretion he trusted absolutely. He briefed them thoroughly on the case, on the Carver family, and on the plan he had developed. The deputies would position themselves in concealed locations around the farm, close enough to respond within minutes, but far enough away to avoid detection by the Carvers. Blackwood would stay at the farm for several days, making himself an appealing target by displaying wealth and vulnerability. If the Carvers attempted to murder him, the deputies would intervene, catching the family in the act. If nothing happened after several days, Blackwood would leave, and they would need to develop a different approach. On July 8, 1876, Marshal Blackwood returned to the Carver farm, this time posing as a wealthy merchant traveling to San Francisco to establish a trading business. He arrived in mid-afternoon, driving a wagon loaded with trunks and crates that suggested substantial resources. He made sure the Carvers saw him counting money when he paid for his supper and lodging. He mentioned that he was in no particular hurry, that he was considering resting at the farm for several days before continuing his journey. He presented himself as prosperous, alone, and vulnerable. The Carvers responded exactly as Blackwood had hoped. They welcomed him warmly, offered him their best guest room, and began the subtle process of isolation and evaluation that they had perfected over 2 years of murder. Martha served him generous portions at meals. Elijah engaged him in long conversations about business opportunities in California. The children were friendly, but not intrusive. Everything about the family's behavior suggested honest frontier hospitality. But Blackwood, alert and watchful despite his pretense of relaxed trust, noticed the small signs that suggested something more sinister was underway. The way Elijah and Samuel exchanged glances when they thought he was not looking. The manner in which Martha encouraged him to eat more, to drink the wine she offered, to relax and rest after his long journey. The fact that young Thomas casually asked about his traveling companions, and seemed pleased to hear that he was traveling alone. The way the entire family seemed to be waiting for something, like predators watching prey and calculating the perfect moment to strike. On his second night at the farm, Blackwood noticed that his evening wine had a slightly bitter taste beneath its sweetness. He pretended to drink it but actually poured most of it into the chamber pot when no one was watching. He made a show of yawning and stumbling slightly as he climbed the stairs to his room, suggesting that whatever sedative had been added to the wine was taking effect. He entered his room, loudly prepared for bed, and then waited in the darkness with his pistol drawn and his senses alert. The farmhouse grew quiet as the evening progressed into night. Blackwood heard the family moving about downstairs, heard their voices in muffled conversation, heard them eventually retiring to their own rooms. He waited, muscles tense, wondering if his suspicions were correct, or if he had simply become paranoid after weeks of investigation. The hours passed slowly. Midnight came and went. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. Then, at approximately 2:30 in the morning, Blackwood heard the creak of floorboards in the hallway outside his room. Soft footsteps approached his door. The handle turned slowly, carefully, clearly trying to avoid making noise. The door opened just wide enough for 2 figures to slip through. In the faint moonlight, coming through the window, Blackwood recognized Elijah and Samuel Carver. Both men carried knives. Both moved with the careful precision of people who had done this many times before. The Carvers approached the bed, where they believed Blackwood lay drugged and unconscious. They raised their knives, preparing to strike, and at that moment, Blackwood stood up from behind the dresser, where he had been concealing himself, leveled his pistol at the 2 men, and spoke clearly and firmly. The command to drop their weapons and surrender was followed immediately by the sound of the front door being kicked open downstairs. Blackwood's 4 deputies stormed into the farmhouse, securing the building and preventing the rest of the Carver family from escaping or destroying evidence. Within minutes, all 6 members of the Carver family were restrained and under guard. The trap had worked perfectly, but as Blackwood and his deputies began to search the farmhouse, and particularly to examine that heavily locked basement, they discovered that the attempted murder they had just prevented was merely the most recent in a long series of horrors. The basement revealed secrets that would shock even hardened lawmen, and that would provide evidence for what would become one of the most sensational criminal trials in the history of the American West. The basement stairs descended into darkness that seemed to resist the lantern light the deputies carried. The air grew noticeably colder as they descended, and it carried odors that immediately troubled the experienced lawmen. The smell of old blood, the smell of rendered fat, the smell of preserved meat, and beneath all of that, a sickly sweet corruption that suggested death and decay. The basement had been divided into several distinct areas, each serving a specific function in the Carver's operation. The first area, nearest to the stairs, contained what appeared to be a normal root cellar, with shelves of preserved vegetables, barrels of grain, and hanging bundles of dried herbs. But this section was merely a facade, designed to provide innocent explanation if anyone happened to glimpse into the basement. Beyond it lay the areas that revealed the family's true activities. The second area contained the butchering equipment, heavy wooden tables, scarred and stained from repeated use, cutting tools of various sizes, from large cleavers to small precise knives, all kept sharp and clean, hooks mounted on ceiling beams, designed to suspend carcasses during processing, buckets and basins for collecting blood and other fluids. Everything was organized with the efficiency of a professional operation, positioned for maximum utility and minimum wasted effort. The third area was devoted to preservation and storage. Here the deputies found barrels of salt for curing, smoking racks, and most horrifyingly, a large cold storage room that took advantage of Wyoming's cool underground temperatures to keep meat fresh for extended periods. The storage room contained numerous packages wrapped in cloth and paper, each carefully labeled with dates and cryptic notations. When the deputies opened these packages, they found cuts of meat that their experience told them did not come from cattle, pigs, or any other common livestock. The fourth area contained the Carver's record-keeping system. Elijah had maintained detailed journals documenting every family they had murdered, every victim they had processed, and even calculations of the resources gained from each crime. The journals revealed that the Carvers had killed 43 families over a period of just over 2 years, representing at least 173 individual victims. The records included names when known, dates of death, numbers of victims, estimated ages, physical descriptions, and detailed inventories of possessions taken. It was an accountant's ledger applied to mass murder. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was the fifth area, which appeared to be a kind of workshop, where the Carvers processed items that could not be consumed or easily sold. Here the deputies found grinding equipment for reducing bones to powder, rendering vessels for converting fat into soap and candles, and carefully sorted piles of hair that Martha had apparently been saving for some eventual use. Every part of their victims had been utilized for some purpose. Nothing had been wasted. As the deputies continued their search of the property beyond the basement, they found more evidence of the Carvers' crimes. Buried in various locations around the farm were the personal effects that could not be sold or used without risk of identification: jewelry with inscriptions, photographs, family Bibles with names written inside, children's toys, letters and documents, all buried like shameful secrets that the Carvers could not quite bring themselves to destroy completely. The discovery of the Carvers' crimes created immediate sensations throughout Wyoming territory and beyond. News of the cannibal family spread rapidly through telegraph communications and newspaper reports. Within days, journalists from eastern papers were arriving in Wyoming to cover the story. Families of the missing, learning that their loved one's fate had finally been determined, began arriving to demand justice. The territorial governor personally ordered that the case be prosecuted with the full resources of the territorial legal system. The Carvers themselves, held in the territorial jail while awaiting trial, offered no explanations and showed no remorse for their actions. Elijah remained silent, refusing to answer questions about his motives or methods. Martha seemed confused by the outrage their activities had generated, apparently unable to understand why their practical use of available resources was considered criminal. The children, particularly the younger ones, appeared traumatized by the sudden disruption of what they had been taught to view as normal family life. As summer progressed toward fall, the territorial prosecutor prepared the case against the Carver family, compiling evidence that would ensure convictions and that would reveal to the public the full scope of one of the most horrific crime sprees in American history. But questions remained that would never be fully answered. How had an apparently normal family descended into such systematic evil? What psychological factors had allowed even the youngest children to participate in cannibalism without apparent distress? And perhaps most troubling of all, were the Carvers unique, or might similar horrors be operating in other remote locations along the frontier trails? The trial of the Carver family began on October 15, 1880, in Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory. The courthouse was packed beyond capacity, with hundreds of spectators crowding into every available space, and hundreds more gathering outside, hoping for news of the proceedings. Journalists from newspapers as far away as New York and San Francisco had traveled to cover what was already being called the trial of the century. Families of the victims filled the front rows, their faces reflecting a mixture of grief, rage, and desperate hope that justice would finally be served for their murdered loved ones. The prosecution was led by Territorial Attorney General Harrison Whitmore, a skilled lawyer who had built his career on high-profile criminal cases. Whitmore understood that while the evidence against the Carvers was overwhelming, the nature of their crimes was so extreme that careful presentation would be necessary to avoid the risk of jurors becoming so horrified that they might question the reliability of the evidence itself. He needed to prove not just that the Carvers had committed murder, but that they had done so systematically, repeatedly, and with full awareness of the evil nature of their actions. The defense attorneys, appointed by the territorial court, because no lawyer would voluntarily represent the family, faced an impossible task. The evidence was damning, the public outrage was intense, and their clients offered no cooperation in mounting any meaningful defense. Elijah Carver maintained his silence, refusing to speak even to his own lawyers. Martha seemed genuinely bewildered by the charges, unable or unwilling to acknowledge that her actions constituted crimes. The children, traumatized by their arrest and imprisonment, could provide no coherent explanation for their participation in their family's activities. The trial lasted 3 weeks, during which the prosecution methodically presented the evidence that Marshal Blackwood and his deputies had gathered. The journals found in the basement were entered into evidence, their pages filled with Elijah's meticulous handwriting documenting every family murdered, every victim processed, every resource extracted from the crimes. 43 families, 173 individuals, men, women, and children, ranging in age from infants to elderly grandparents. The journals even included sketches showing how bodies had been divided and processed, drawings so detailed and clinical that several jurors became physically ill when they were displayed. Physical evidence from the basement was presented, though the judge allowed only limited display of the actual preserved human remains, recognizing that too graphic a presentation might overwhelm the jury's ability to function rationally. Instead, the prosecution relied on testimony from physicians who had examined the evidence and could confirm that the meat found in the Carver's storage areas was indeed human flesh. The butchering equipment was displayed, with experts explaining how it had been used and pointing out the modifications Elijah had made to adapt standard butchering tools for processing human bodies. The testimony of the few survivors proved particularly powerful. 3 individuals who had stayed at the Carver farm but had left before the family could implement their murder plans testified about the hospitality they had received, the reasonable prices, and the friendly demeanor of the family. Their testimony established that the Carvers had consciously created an appealing facade to attract victims. One witness, a trail guide who had brought multiple wagon trains past the Carver farm, testified that he had recommended the farm to travelers based on positive reports from others, inadvertently sending families to their deaths. The prosecution also presented testimony from experts who had examined the farm's financial records and the possessions found buried around the property. These witnesses established that the Carvers had accumulated substantial wealth through their crimes, selling stolen livestock, wagons and other goods through distant markets, where the items' origins would not be questioned. The family had prospered enormously from their systematic murder, transforming themselves from modest settlers into one of the wealthiest farming operations in that region of Wyoming. Perhaps the most disturbing testimony came from a physician who had been asked to examine the Carver children and assess their psychological state. The doctor testified that the younger children, particularly Mary, who had been only 11 when the family began their murder spree, appeared to have been raised to view cannibalism as normal behavior. They showed no signs of the guilt or horror that would be expected from children who had participated in such activities. Instead, they seemed primarily confused about why their family was being punished for what they had been taught was simply an efficient use of available resources. This testimony raised troubling questions about criminal culpability and moral development. If children had been raised from a young age to view murder and cannibalism as acceptable, were they fully responsible for their actions, or were they victims of their parents' twisted indoctrination? The prosecution argued that regardless of how the children had been raised, they were old enough to understand that killing was wrong, and that they had shown no signs of resistance or distress as they participated in their family's crimes. The defense, such as it was, could offer no effective counter-argument. The trial also revealed details about the Carver's methodology that demonstrated the calculated nature of their crimes. Testimony established that the family had carefully selected victims based on specific criteria. They targeted families traveling alone or in small groups who would not be immediately missed. They preferred immigrants with limited English skills who had few connections in America. They avoided taking anyone who traveled with larger wagon trains or who had mentioned having friends or relatives waiting for them at their destinations. Every aspect of their operation reflected careful planning and risk management. Medical experts testified about the evidence found in the basement regarding the family's consumption of human flesh. The Carvers had not been desperate people driven to cannibalism by starvation or survival necessity. They had been well-fed, prosperous farmers who had chosen to kill and consume human beings as a regular practice. Analysis of the preserved meat in their storage areas suggested that they had maintained a substantial supply at all times, far more than would have been necessary for simple sustenance. The consumption of their victims appeared to have become not just accepted, but preferred within the family. The question of motive became a central focus of the trial. Why had the Carvers committed these crimes? Financial gain explained part of their behavior, as they had clearly profited enormously from stealing their victims' possessions and resources. But the systematic cannibalism suggested motivations beyond simple theft. Some observers theorized that Elijah Carver harbored some form of psychological compulsion, perhaps dating back to experiences during his claimed time as a butcher in Missouri. Others suggested that the entire family suffered from a shared delusion or moral defect that allowed them to view other human beings as resources to be exploited rather than as people with rights and dignity. The defense made a half-hearted attempt to suggest that the family had been driven to their crimes by some form of frontier madness, that the isolation and hardship of life in Wyoming territory had somehow broken their moral compass. But this argument found no support in the evidence. The Carvers had arrived in Wyoming with resources and had established a prosperous farm through normal means before beginning their murder spree. They had not been desperate or starving. They had chosen evil deliberately and had pursued it systematically for over 2 years. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury received the case on November 5, 1880. They deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with their verdict. All 6 members of the Carver family were found guilty of murder. Given the number of victims and the particularly heinous nature of the crimes, the jury recommended that the adults be sentenced to death by hanging. The fate of the children posed more complex questions, particularly young Mary, who had been barely into adolescence when the crimes began. The judge, after expressing his horror at the crimes and his sympathy for the victims' families, pronounced sentence on November 8, 1880. Elijah Carver and his wife Martha were sentenced to death by hanging, to be carried out within 60 days. Samuel Carver, age 21 at the time of sentencing, was also sentenced to death. The younger children presented a more difficult question after considering arguments about their ages and the possibility that they had been indoctrinated rather than freely choosing evil. The judge sentenced Rebecca, Thomas, and Mary to life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole to be considered only after they had served a minimum of 30 years. The execution of Elijah, Martha, and Samuel Carver took place on January 12, 1881, at the Territorial Prison in Rawlins, Wyoming. Over 2,000 spectators gathered to witness the hangings, and newspapers across the country provided detailed coverage of the event. According to witnesses, Elijah Carver maintained his silence to the very end, refusing to offer any explanation for his crimes or any expression of remorse. Martha appeared confused and distressed, crying quietly but saying nothing coherent. Samuel, the eldest son, who had been his father's primary accomplice in the murders, showed no emotion as he mounted the scaffold. The three were hanged simultaneously at 10 o'clock in the morning. According to the official report, all three died quickly, though Martha's lighter weight resulted in a slower death that disturbed some witnesses. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves in the prison cemetery, with authorities fearing that marked graves might become sites of morbid curiosity or vandalism. The fate of the three younger Carver children proved more complicated and more tragic than anyone anticipated. Rebecca, Thomas, and Mary were initially housed in the Territorial Prison, but officials quickly realized that placing children in an adult prison facility created significant problems. In 1883, they were transferred to separate institutions, with the two girls being sent to a reform school for delinquent youth, and Thomas being placed in a facility for juvenile offenders. Rebecca Carver died in 1889, at age 26, succumbing to tuberculosis that swept through the reform school where she was confined. She had never spoken publicly about her experiences with her family and had shown no signs of remorse or understanding of the evil she had participated in. Thomas died in 1894 at age 28, reportedly by suicide, hanging himself in his cell with a rope made from torn bedsheets. Mary, the youngest, survived into the 20th century, living until 1923. But she spent her entire adult life institutionalized, never gaining parole, and never successfully reintegrating into normal society. The Carver farm itself became a site of morbid fascination in the immediate aftermath of the trial. Souvenir hunters descended on the property, stripping it of anything that could be carried away as a memento of the horror that had occurred there. Local authorities, recognizing that the farm had become an unwholesome attraction, eventually ordered the buildings burned to the ground. The land was seized by the territorial government and later sold at auction, though no one would build on the site for decades afterward. The impact of the Carver case extended far beyond Wyoming territory. The case received extensive coverage in newspapers throughout the United States and even in European publications. The systematic nature of the crimes, the involvement of an entire family, including children, and the cannibalistic elements combined to create a story that horrified readers everywhere. The case became a cautionary tale about the dangers lurking on the frontier trails, and about the evil that could hide behind facades of respectability and hospitality. For the families of the victims, the conclusion of the trial brought a measure of closure, but could never fully heal the wounds of their losses. Many had traveled to Wyoming, hoping to find their loved ones alive, or at least to recover their remains for proper burial. Instead, they learned that their family members had been murdered, butchered, and consumed, their bodies processed so thoroughly that individual identification was impossible. The journals had provided names and dates, confirming the deaths and allowing families to grieve with certainty, but the inability to recover remains for burial added another layer of tragedy to their losses. The case also prompted changes in how territorial authorities monitored remote settlements and investigated disappearances. The statistical pattern that had allowed Marshall Blackwood to identify the Carvers demonstrated the value of coordinating information across jurisdictions and tracking patterns, rather than treating each disappearance as an isolated incident. New protocols were established for investigating missing persons cases along the frontier trails, and increased attention was paid to remote homesteads that positioned themselves to exploit vulnerable travelers. From a psychological perspective, the Carver case raised questions that remained largely unanswerable with the scientific understanding of the time. How did an entire family become involved in systematic murder and cannibalism? What psychological factors allowed even young children to participate without apparent distress? Were the Carvers suffering from some form of shared psychosis, or had they simply made evil choices that became normalized through repetition? 19th century medicine and psychology lacked the frameworks to fully understand cases of this nature, and many questions about the Carvers' motivations and mental states remained unresolved. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of immigrants and travelers on the frontier trails. Many of the Carvers' victims had been people pursuing the American dream, families who had sold everything they owned for the chance at a better life in the West. Their limited English skills, their unfamiliarity with American customs, and their isolation from support networks had made them perfect targets for predators like the Carvers. The case demonstrated that the frontier, while offering opportunities for honest people, also provided cover for those with evil intentions. In the years following the trial, stories and legends grew up around the Carver case, with many embellishments and exaggerations added to the already horrific reality. Some claimed that the Carvers had murdered hundreds, rather than the documented 43 families. Others suggested supernatural elements, claiming that the family had been possessed by demons or had practiced dark magic. These legends obscured the truth that the Carvers had been entirely human, that their evil had required no supernatural explanation, and that this very ordinariness made their crimes even more disturbing. The Oregon Trail continued to carry travelers westward for several more decades after the Carver trial, though the volume of traffic gradually declined as railroads provided faster and safer alternatives. The stretch of trail that passed near the former Carver farm site became notorious, with travelers hurrying through that section and few choosing to camp overnight in the area. Stories about the Cannibal family became part of trail lore, told around campfires as cautionary tales about the dangers of trusting strangers. Today, more than a century and a half after the Carvers' crimes, the case remains one of the most disturbing episodes in the history of American westward expansion. The site of the farm is now private ranch land, with no marker indicating what occurred there. The victims remain largely forgotten, except by their descendants, their names preserved only in old court documents and newspaper archives. But the case serves as a permanent reminder that evil can flourish anywhere that opportunity, isolation, and moral failure combine, and that the most dangerous predators are often those who understand exactly how to exploit human vulnerability and trust. The legacy of the Carver family is one of horror, but also of justice finally served, and of the importance of vigilance in protecting vulnerable populations from exploitation. Their story reminds us that beneath the veneer of civilization, whether on the frontier or in modern society, there exist individuals capable of extraordinary evil, and that constant awareness and swift action are necessary to prevent such horrors from occurring again.